Acesta este un podcast al Țuca Zbârcea și Asociații, un canal de discuție creat cu scopul de a dezbate implicațiile juridice ale crizei generate de coronavirus. El nu este și nu se vrea a fi un substitut de consultații juridice și analize de drept care să angajeze răspunderea societății sau avocaților săi, ci este mai degrabă o invitație la dialog.
Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of The Law in the Times of Corona of Țuca Zbârcea and Associates podcast on legal and tax topics streaming from the global crisis brought by the coronavirus pandemic. I am Narcisa Ichim, and for this episode I have invited Stefano Rossi, partner of Anderson Tax and Legal Italy and leader of the transfer pricing practice of Anderson Network in Europe. Today's dialogue will be focused on the impact of coronavirus on transfer pricing. Stefano, representatives of multinational groups with activities in Romania are currently facing a significant number of challenges, and transfer pricing policies represent one of particular interest. I welcome you to our podcast and start by asking you, now, after approximately 3 months of lockdown, where do we start from an economic perspective?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for this invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here and record this podcast. I would say, where do we start? The COVID-19 pandemic has hit global trade and investment at an unprecedented speed and scale. This is the starting point. Multinational companies faced an initial supply shock and then a demand shock as more and more countries ordered people to stay at home. So the OECD has warned that the COVID-19 is the greatest danger to the world economy since the 2008 financial crisis, and it is therefore to be expected that the COVID-19 epidemic will have a negative bearing on the operating income of M&As and impose a considerable burden on cash flow of M&Es as well as its individual subsidiaries. Unfortunately, this is the second time in 12 years that the economy and financial markets are facing an unexpected and unprecedented crisis for uncertain proportions. Let's just think that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell recently suggested that the economy could contract by up to 30% during the second quarter of 2020, what's expected to be the biggest drop in quarterly GDP in US in history because of community lockdowns across the country and voluntary business closures in an effort to combat the outbreak of the COVID-19. So by way of comparison, the sharpest quarterly drop in economic activity during financial crisis was an 8.4 decline in the fourth quarter of 2008. Given the sudden halt to worldwide economic activity in recent weeks, economists believe that 2020 could see a deeper recession than 2008, but luckily that it will not descend into a depression. And if this scenario plays out, it will be the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So if we compare the two crises, in 2008, the banks were the source of the problem for financial markets. This time, banks aren't the culprit in this downturn. The 2020 crisis started off as a supply-side crisis, and as we know, factories in China were closed due to the epidemic, and that led to a lack of components for many companies in the West. However, that was followed by a second phase. So once the pandemic has spread, a crisis on demand resulted because consumption was impacted by containment measures. In this world, in this environment, we are experiencing two side effects of the contractions of the global trade. The former is that it takes longer to settle an invoice, reversing a previous trend of faster payments. And secondly, the lack of orders going through the supply chain is building up to another tidal wave with new orders slowing and invoices dropping off. So just think that some companies, big companies, have already agreed to pay suppliers earlier than usual terms or are extending credit to retail customers just to safeguard the economy. We have seen crises before, but not like this. We don't know how deep and broad and long this crisis will be. We are at the let's say, the intersection of a social and economic crisis, communities will recover, markets will recover, consumer confidence will return. But what we should bear in mind is that the landscape won't simply reset to where we stood before the pandemic outbreak. And in such context, M&Es should keep a closer eye on liquidity, on operations, people, legal factors, and of course, TP policy.
Starting from what you said, as multinational groups have diversified their worldwide activities and, of course, their operating models and transfer pricing policies as a consequence, we have witnessed that transfer pricing has become one of the hot topics of international tax. On the other side, I also noticed a new context that is arising these days, both at personal and economic level, the idea of the new normal. Can we expect to deal with a new normal in terms of transfer pricing? And if so, what would be, in your opinion, the main pillars of this new chapter?
Well, actually, of course, the answer to this question is yes, we will experience a new normal also from a transfer pricing perspective. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities of complex global supply chains built on lean manufacturing principles. One likely consequence is that global firms will diversify their supply chains in the future instead of relying only on China. Manufacturing hubs such as Vietnam, Mexico, and India are most likely to benefit from this shift. We will also see a decentralization of manufacturing capacity with companies looking to bring production home. So there will be business restructurings in the short terms. Let's say M&Es will try to stay less global and more local. And policymakers may be increasingly pressured to consider whether certain products need to be manufactured in the country or in the region. And the transition to a new model for supply chain will be underpinned by a rapid digitalization of global trade. So with technologies like artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things, supply chains could quickly switch to alternative providers when regular suppliers face disruption, which is the case we're facing today. It is clear that the current crisis is an opportunity, not only a challenge, to reset a system that has relied on outdated processes, and thus creating smart, I would say nimble supply chains is the key to building up a new global trade. In such context, the basic theme behind realignment of transfer pricing policies should be to match the related transfer pricing policies with the current realities of the business in terms of functions performed, risks assumed, and assets deployed, and markets. So, revised approaches to supply chain, including, let's say, new procurement models, market strategies, logistics, service delivery approach, will need corresponding adjustments to the transfer pricing models. So in this context, there are some important factors that we may want to consider. First, transfer price for lockdown or temporarily halted operation should be revised to reflect current fact pattern under uncontrolled scenario. Also, transfer pricing policies should be amended to account for idle capacities related to the extraordinary COVID-19 situation. We should also consider the impact of workers performing functions in new places than before that affect transfer taxing rights allocated to group entities in global supply chain to be factored in transfer pricing models. Again, transfer pricing models are to be reviewed to avoid mismatches with profits and losses, and the transfer pricing impact on treasury functions and matters should be considered, including working capital positions, investments, and all of these in line with intercompany arrangements. We should also do not forget that the COVID-19 will impact APAs both in place or which are underway and are waiting for a sign. And we should keep in mind that the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the industry in general and business in particular has to form part of the filing documentation so that it would be possible to discuss with the tax authority on extraordinary circumstances.
Okay, Stefano, until we will experience this new normal, and I think that some of the items that you mentioned are already happening, another aspect worth considering is the fact that a significant number of groups are facing now liquidity problems, and this is a phenomenon that probably we will witness in the future as well. What short-term measures could these groups undertake, also considering the recent OECD guidelines on financial transactions?
Well, actually, as the previous crisis, cash is the king. So the pressure on cash flow is very high in both related and unrelated parties. And this, such pressure may result in a range of financial support, not just between related parties, but also between third parties. And for instance, suppliers may allow customers to pay them on a slightly delayed basis to help them manage their cash flows. Such practice may be adopted without a change in the price in order to preserve long-standing customer relationships. It could happen. So similarly, associated enterprises may also offer their related party customers a delay in paying without an impact on the transfer price. And as such, M&Es could forecast the potential cash flow issue in the future to determine alternative methods to support the cash flow of their subsidiaries in a timely and effective manner. And in such cases, it is necessary for taxpayers to demonstrate that such practices are consistent with how they will transact with third parties. So here a big point is documenting and documentation. Furthermore, M&Es may also increase intercompany lending in order to manage the working capital needs of their subsidiaries. And intercompany financing is, as we know, a hot topic for taxpayers. And with the recent guidance provided by the OECD, it is likely that the tax authority will give close scrutiny to loans and other financial support extended within the group. So, with respect to short-term measures to counteract cash flow concerns, I think we will cite cash pool arrangements and financial guarantees as a measure to help and support cash flows needs at subsidiaries level. So we could have a case in which a cash pooling arrangement is not in place. Okay, so then the main issue could be to assess if the cash pool leader performs high value-added activities, bears financial risk, so that he will be entitled of a lending margin, or if we should be remunerated as a service provider, and then a cost plus, will be acceptable. In case of existing agreements, it will be probably useful to foresee to review credit limits and to potentially remunerate those subsidiaries which are providing liquidity buffer. And with respect to the importance of intra-group guarantees, I would like to mention that this is a very effective way to lower the interest paid by subsidiaries with respect to third parties lending. So it is important to undertake, as the OECD has pointed out, a double-sided analysis. So we should consider both the lender perspectives and the borrower perspective. And with this respect, it is important to consider that some risks may arise from these short-term funding measures. At first, we have to be very keen and careful that for tax purposes, what it is purported to be a loan could not be regarded as a loan by the tax authority. So it is important to characterize the funding that is flowing intercompany, because all or part of what it is considered as equity contribution and not debt shall bear and be considered as dividend and should bear withholding taxes issues with it. With respect to financial guarantees, it is very important that that there is a legal obligation on the guarantor to honor the lender's commitments. I guess this is the most important. And with respect to the cash pooling, the underlying principle of the cash pooling is what we should take care of. So participants should be better off by being in the cash pooling arrangement than being without the cash pooling arrangement. And that is basically it.
Stefano, you know that Romania represents a country that imports capital, and we have here a significant number of companies that perform activities based on limited functional profiles. How could lost positions be treated by such companies in the context of COVID-19?
So this is a very big issue, and not only multinational enterprises, but also tax authorities, in my view, are waiting for the OECD guidance on this topic. So we still have to wait, but we have already some guidance on this. So let's say that while tax authorities, there's no doubt that tax authorities like the potential financial upside that such models provide, but they are less enthusiastic about the downside financial risk that materializes when local sales decline, and this is the case. In general, whether it is appropriate for losses to be shared among the multinational group depends on the nature of the loss and the contractual arrangements in place within the group. If we look at the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, low-risk functions such as contract or toll manufacturers or low-risk distributors are not expected to generate losses for a long period of time. However, this does not imply that loss-making transactions can never be admissible. And of course, every case has to be assessed on an individual basis. The OECD guidelines also state that there are circumstances in which an independent enterprise may not realize a profit from the performance of services. Therefore, it does not always need to be the case that an arm's length principle will result in a profit for an associated enterprise performing an intra-group service. So, to summarize, losses can arise for a variety of reasons, and establishing that those losses relate to the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 outbreak rather than intercompany pricing is key in supporting and defending transfer pricing positions. So companies, the advice should be that companies should analyze the commercial and financial causes of the loss and distinguish between the pandemic period and the recovery period, which means companies should demonstrate how COVID-19 is changing the commercial circumstances of the business in reducing customer demand or disruption supply chain. Also, we should bear in mind that there are comparability adjustments that should be specifically applied to this pandemic period. Okay, so apart from the well-known comparability adjustments, we should be keen and provide for adjustments to financials of comparable companies' results. And M&Es may want to isolate the impact of COVID-19 crisis by, let's say, adjusting the tested party and comparable companies' results based on the SG&A to sales ratio experienced during the unaffected period, so before the pandemic. Because we know that during an economic downturn, companies typically experience an increase in selling and general and administrative expenses, which is SG&A, as a percentage of sales, given they cannot rapidly adjust their fixed costs to offset lower sales. Thus, although they may no longer require the same amount of assets to operate their business, contractual arrangements like leases, for example, do not allow for short-term changes without significant penalties. And in business economics, companies have an economic incentive to continue operations despite losses, as long as revenues offset variable costs. So adjusting a tested party result may also be necessary to account for government subsidies or available tax credits. So due to the current exceptional situation, one alternative could be reducing the profit markup of routine group companies to zero. But this could probably not be feasible according to the local tax authority view on such positions. Maybe another option could be to adjust the transfer prices or profit margins agreed within the routine entities in the short term to the lower end of the interquartile range. Nonetheless, we should bear in mind that while describing very accurately the particular hardship for the group and the negotiations of exceptional circumstances between the parties, the advice is to prepare a rock-solid set of documentation in order to, let's say, justify any reduced remuneration.
And what about centralized services? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, very often it happens that the headquarters are providing support services to their subsidiaries of branch. There are management fees that are charged within the group, but we should bear in mind that given the lockdown, many people were forced to stay at home, and many of them could not actually work even remotely, which means they were not able to perform their functions underlying the services that were meant to be charged within the group. My advice should be to take into consideration these circumstances in order to assess whether or not at least a share of costs should be actually charged to local entities or branches.
Okay, and as a last question, do you have any advice for us, also considering the experience so far in Italy?
Yeah, of course. I will distinguish this into two categories. In the very short term, and with very short term, I mean weeks, days, it is crucial to review benchmarks for routine entities. As we said, the point is new benchmark data and financial projections may not be available in the short term. In the, let's say, medium term, okay, but before the end of the year, we should consider that using comparable sets from well-known databases is like to present a number of issues. Let's say if we are undertaking a price setting approach, so an ex-ante method, the timing of data which are added to databases typically means that 2020 results will be tested against data from 2017 to 2019, where of course multiple year is accepted and therefore do not reflect the current economic downturn. But also if we consider the other suggested approach from the OECD, which is the outcome testing, 2020 data could be available only late in 2021. So also in these circumstances, there is an issue in terms of compensating adjustments that should be made within the deadline where the relevant corporate income tax return is transmitted to the tax authority. This depends on the deadlines in each country. And even if 2020 data is available, it is not likely to fully reflect the downturn as companies with persistent losses and those that have gone bankrupt will not be part of the comparable set. This is usually part of the search strategy. We exclude lost companies normally in most countries. But we should keep in mind that the US, during the former global financial crisis, allowed taxpayers to include lost companies. This could be a solution. Maybe it could be also feasible to look at historical divisions of profits across supply chain and probably mirror the pattern in 2020 data. Maybe also it could be feasible to reflect the downturn in 2008, 2009 data and apply such decrease to the latest data of comparables we can get from the databases. And of course, reviewing and amending existing contracts, in particular, including force majeure clauses, is key. I would like just to mention a couple of aspects that we did not address during this podcast, but I believe are very important for multinational enterprises. And the first one is the impact of DAC 6, and in particular, when the specific hallmark if is triggered, meaning if there's a business restructuring, so there is a stripping of functions and risks, and assets, if the projected EBIT of the restructured company is in the following 3 years expected to be less than 50% as it was before, this is going to trigger mandatory disclosure rules. Last but not least, we are, now considering the current environment, and we are almost every country is following the OECD transfer pricing guidelines. The point is, this could not be the standard anymore, so it could be wise and useful to make sort of stress test in order to test the new model under the unified approach model proposed by the OECD under the Pillar 1. So this could be, my final take for today's podcast.
Stefano, thank you very much for the participation to this dialogue, and I would also like to thank to our listeners and to hope that this information will prove useful during these disruptive times. For any questions or clarifications that you may need in relation to the transfer pricing challenges brought forward by the coronavirus pandemic, please contact us at helpline@tzuk.ro. Until next time.
Thank you very much.